veterans have fairly unique, complex health problems, and the private sector doesn't see that kind of stuff very often. And it's a privatization disaster that we can watch happening in real time, and it's happening right now.
Are you on? Which side are you on?
Jacqueline Simon is the policy director for the American Federation of Government Employees, AFGE, which is the largest federal employees union. They represent some 700,000 federal workers across the United States. Jacqueline, welcome back to the program. Appreciate your time this morning.
Well, thank you for having me.
So we reached out a couple of weeks ago about talking about this idea that was proposed by Elon Musk and Donald Trump for a Department of Government Efficiency, or an efficiency commission. And so I'm interested just generally, when Elon Musk makes a proposal like this, what does AFGE think that he means to do?
Well, we've seen these kinds of commissions before. I mean, the most notorious that really had an impact, a huge impact, was the Grace Commission back when Ronald Reagan was president. But many presidents have proposed various kinds of commissions, which, they assemble some wise business leaders, wise men, to take a look at the government and decide what should stay and what should go. Inevitably, and especially with Elon Musk, these business leaders have conflicts of interest, because what they want to cut is what they really want to privatize, so that they can perform these government functions for a profit. And that's what we would expect, of course, Elon Musk to do. He's got conflict with several government agencies that are trying to regulate his businesses. NASA, the Department of Labor, with his union busting at Tesla. You've got the National Transportation Safety Board, when his Teslas run off the road and kill people. Right. I mean, you've got all kinds of conflicts. I think he has some kind of a, I can't remember the name of it, but some kind of a medical device that he wants to insert in people's brains. Of course, Neuralink, that's right. That would need FDA approval. So, you've got all those kinds of conflicts of interest from Musk himself. But I think that, the Department of Veterans Affairs tried to assemble a commission like this that would have gone through an inventory to all the VA hospitals and clinics across the country and decided which ones to keep and which ones to close, and all in the context of more privatization of veterans' health care. So that's really what it's about.
Right. And that's exactly like you said, most of these initiatives by, fancy business people, it's interesting that all of these commissions, as far as I can tell, and maybe you can correct me, I don't think I'm wrong, but as far as I can tell, most of these initiatives or these commissions or these committees, they never include the people that actually do the work, right? You would think that if you wanted a committee to genuinely modernize or revamp the VA, that maybe you would have like a VA nurse or a representative from AFGE that works in the VA on one of these committees. And I have never heard of any representatives like that being on these committees. It's all like business people who don't actually do the work. And so what we've seen from committees like this is exactly like you said, they point to privatization as an answer. They say that we have to get these services out of the government because the government is just bad, like de facto. Can you give us a couple of examples or expand on a couple of the examples that you gave about how these privatization schemes have worked in the past? I mean, have they been, shining examples of success for the American consumer or the American veteran or federal workers?
Well, I just want to go back to the first thing you said about having a worker representative on these commissions and boards. It's not unusual. I mean, it's not common, but it happens that on a smaller scale, maybe not a government-wide commission, but an agency-specific commission, that they will put or they invite a member of a union, a representative from a union or a professional organization, maybe even the Federal Managers Association, for example, federal, the people who, civil servants who manage government programs. And so, but, then that's, of course, a corrupting kind of thing. And just to get back to the whole concept of these kinds of commissions, they're doing the job that Congress doesn't want to do. Congress's basic job is to authorize and authorize the existence of these programs and agencies, and then appropriate money to fund them. And if they were doing their jobs, they would deauthorize or refuse to fund whatever they thought shouldn't exist in the federal government. And that way, if you believe in that there's such a thing as representative government, that way the people making the decisions would not necessarily be corporate leaders, but it would be representatives in Congress who have to be elected and are answerable to their constituents. But members of Congress hate to do that kind of stuff. They want to have us, they want to be removed a couple of steps. And invariably, these big commissions come back to Congress as just an up or down vote with no amendments possible. Take it or leave it. Here's what we propose. Here's our whole big package. Take it or leave it, up or down. And fortunately, during the Obama administration, he had a truly horrendous commission like that would have raised the Social Security age and cut Social Security benefits. And fortunately, Congress voted it down. But there was a lot of pressure to vote for it. Privatization is, everybody's always talking about Project 2025. And Project 2025, if you sort of step back and look at what the overall frame for their policy proposals, there's a lot of privatization proposed, certainly in the Department of Veterans Affairs, but also elsewhere throughout government. There's also a substantial amount that they want to get rid of through block grants to the states. There's a big movement now in the right to send everything back to the states and let them decide. Why should the federal government make decisions that would affect everybody? Let's, do things state by state, and allow, of course, waivers of state laws on child labor and minimum wage and environmental laws, anything. You can have the states compete with each other down to the lowest possible standards in order to attract businesses. We've seen that all the time, right?
Yeah, it's worked so well, especially with like unemployment, for instance. It's worked really well to have that be a state-by-state program.
Right. And then, the third way, you've got privatization, you've got the block grants, and then the other one is just, as I was saying earlier, have Congress just completely take back the authorization for the agency or the program and refuse to fund it. What not everybody realizes, though, is that even if when Congress does appropriate funds for a program or an agency, the White House can impound those funds and refuse to spend them. And that's one of the kinds of scenarios we're thinking about if, for example, we get a Democratic Congress and Donald Trump in the White House. He can still just refuse to fund a program, and then it doesn't exist if it doesn't have funding. Right. So he would have a lot of levers to push if he does get the White House that could overrule the will of Congress. So it's all very bleak.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Right. Yes, it is all very concerning, especially in Huntsville. It's interesting that Huntsville has for years sent somebody as a representative like Mo Brooks, who's just kind of crazed in his anti-government beliefs. Dale Strong is a little bit more moderate, I think. But even still, as dependent on Huntsville is, for instance, on federal investment, it is wild that we have such anti-government people representing us in D.C. But back to the, privatization exam. Have you got any offhand, examples of these, the recommendations from these kind of privatization reports being implemented and what some of the results were?
Well, we've killed these commissions. But, what's the biggest, not the biggest, but one of the biggest areas of privatization that's going on right now in the federal government is veterans health care. We're now up to 40% of all veterans healthcare dollars are being spent on private sector care. Even with the PACT Act, which provided more resources to the VA, and because the number of patients that are now eligible for treatment under the PACT Act grew substantially. So there was a hiring surge at VA, and even with that hiring surge, the proportion of spending has shifted rapidly in the direction of private care, and is only going to grow. There's still much, much more pressure, and God forbid if Donald Trump wins, then you can just say goodbye to the VA healthcare system. They would maybe retain certain things that are not profitable for the private sector to provide. But for the most part, we'd see a lot of closures. We'd see closures all across the country, and it would be private care. And we all know that private care is not only more expensive than the care provided by the government, but it's also been shown by study after study after study to produce worse outcomes for veterans. And so it's just a 1-2 punch. It costs more and the quality's lower. Veterans have fairly unique, complex kind of combinations of health problems as a result of their service. And the VA specializes in treating those kinds of complexities, and the private sector doesn't see that kind of stuff very often. So it's a privatization disaster that we can watch happening in real time, and it's happening right now.
Speaking of some other federal agencies, some of the conversation explicitly mentioned cutting, or Trump explicitly praised Musk for cutting in some of his right. companies that he runs. Could you explain to folks what it would do for federal services if their staff and budget were cut even further? And specifically, I'm thinking about agencies like OSHA and the EEOC, for instance. I seem to remember some really bad statistics about their funding and their staff levels versus the workload over the last 10 to 15 years for those agencies.
Well, OSHA, of course, is part of the Department of Labor. And if you look at this year's appropriations bills that were passed by the House, by the Republicans, and promoted by the Republican Study Committee and the kind of organizations that were behind Project 2025, you've got 10 and 11% cuts in their budget. I think the big one is EPA. Not necessarily EEOC. EPA, they proposed to cut by 40% this year, just in 1 year. I mean, if you look at Project 2025 or the Republican Study Committee's recommendations, they're really obsessed with trying to erase the very concept of climate change from any kind of government research or policy or regulation. And of course, also DEI, but the big one, in terms of dollars and cents and jobs, has to do with trying to do away with all work at EPA and also other agencies, NOAA, the Department of Agriculture, Department of Energy. Department of Energy's got a lot of proposed cuts. If you don't have people doing this work, I think some of the most compelling work comes out of the Department of Agriculture. I mean, anybody, you don't have to be a farmer to know that agriculture really depends on knowledge about climate.
Right.
Nothing is affected more by climate than agriculture, and farmers and ranchers require this data and to be able to project future climate events and trends. And if the agriculture department isn't providing it and isn't doing that research, well, it's not, of course, it's job, it's federal jobs, but it's also the country doing without very important information that will help us prepare ourselves for the future. And that's true at EPA. It's true in every agency.
Right, right. Well, and speaking, we've been talking about how this would affect, the constituents, the citizens of the United States, the people that live here, right? Obviously, it's going to be bad if you do not have a government that is as able to monitor, corporations who want to poison your water, or bosses who want to violate your rights on the job or make you work on safe conditions. It's going to be bad for you in that case. But also, it is worth considering what this would do to federal workers. There are, a lot of people are employed by the federal government. And so, the most extreme end of these types of proposed cuts are on the order of 50% of all federal workers. Vivek Ramaswamy was one of the people proposing that. What would that mean? What would cuts of that magnitude or smaller? I don't think that we would actually be seeing a cut of 50% of all federal employees. But, if they got their way, we would see significant cuts. What would that do to federal workers? What would that mean for us? And then if we did see implementations of some of these more extreme proposals, what would it do to the American economy?
Well, I'm thinking back to George W. Bush's administration. He did, in fact, implement a policy that subjected half of all federal jobs to what privatization studies. There was consideration of contracting out and privatizing literally half of all federal jobs. And I should have brought up the impact on federal employees. Thank you for doing it. Of course, it would be devastating to federal employees to lose their jobs. I mean, these are people who've developed expertise and devoted their lives to public service and devoted their lives to developing the expertise in whatever program they're working in for the benefit of the public. And to just have that ripped away, and of course, the impact on their families, they won't have a paycheck anymore. There's not necessarily a demand in the private sector for their expertise. Maybe the contractor would hire them on different terms and in a different location. It'd be terrible for federal employees. Of course, it's terrible for federal employees. But it's not as far-fetched as it sounds, because we've seen this movie before, and we've seen it most recently with George W. Bush.
I really like that you brought up that recommendation from George W. Bush, because people like to try to, and there's some amount of reason for this, right? But people really like to paint Trump and that movement as unique and totally different from the history of the Republican Party, and just a complete aberration. And these are really kind of rabid, radical types. But actually, in fact, it's very much in the tradition of the modern Republican Party, the kind of Trump wing. So I really appreciate you bringing out that this is even the most radical proposals of the modern kind of Trump movement with respect to the federal government is only a retread of something that George Bush, who now we're supposed to love George Bush, right? I mean, he finger paints. Isn't he so cute? He's such a cute old man. He shares candy with Michelle Obama. We love George Bush. But the most radical proposal for the federal government is just a retread of something that he did 20 years ago. I think that that's a really important point. So, Jacqueline Simon, Policy Director of the American Federation for Government Employees, the largest federal workers union. I really appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Bye.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fg.